Welcome to History Sleuth, a podcast exploring the involvement of history and culture and current events.
My name is Adelaide, and today we are going to go over all the facts of the transatlantic slave trade. But before we get into that, if you're on Twitter, follow me at Sleuth History to get updates about when I post new episodes. And make sure also to follow History Sleuth on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. For Black History Month, I'm doing twice as many episodes, posting on both Tuesday and Thursday. So make sure you get connected so you don't miss anything. Now, let's learn about the transatlantic slave trade. So to give you a general overview and why we're talking about this within Black History Month. So this month I've been focusing more on Black history in America and emphasizing that narrative instead of making it just an aside as it normally is in general education of American history, if it comes up at all. And so an important place to start and to focus on with that, to kind of understand the foundations of what Black history in America looks like, is the transatlantic slave trade. Because starting in about the 16th century to the 19th century, 10 to 12 million enslaved Africans crossed the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, not just to the United States of America, or it was before the U.S. was a country, so the American colonies, but also South and Central America and the different colonies that were in there as well. And so this gigantic forced migration is kind of what established a population of Black Americans. And so, though we don't always want to talk about Black history focusing on all of the sad and traumatic things that Black people have experienced throughout history, I think it is important to have this kind of like foundation and understanding of what this is. And sometimes, especially lately, I feel like talking about the transatlantic slave trade or American slavery has like not been easy. Like people get quickly emotional and defensive, and I think that's really interesting and fascinating to consider more about why are certain aspects of history more touchy for people than others. We weren't there for any of it, you know. Why does some of it get people a little bit more riled up than other bits of it? And I think it's because we don't really have a good understanding of the historical tragedies we hold as a country, or a good way of processing and understanding them. And so that's something that I've become passionate about doing, as well as calling out misinformation and disinformation. So hopefully as we go through these facts together and understand what happened, we'll have a better understanding of what we can do about it and how we can understand that better and respond to it better in the present. So from Britannica, Thomas Lewis at Britannica, he says, the transatlantic slave trade, a segment of the global slave trade that transported between 10 million and 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas from the 16th to the 19th century. It was the second of three stages of the so-called triangular trade, in which arms, textiles, and wine were shipped from Europe to Africa, slaves from Africa to the Americas, and sugar and coffee from the Americas to Europe. By the 1940s, Portuguese ships were already transporting Africans for use as slaves on the sugar plantations in Cape Verde and Madeira Islands in the eastern Atlantic. Spanish conquistadors took African slaves to the Caribbean after 1502, but Portuguese merchants continued to dominate the transatlantic slave trade for another century and a half, operating from their bases in the Congo-Angola area along the west coast of Africa. The Dutch became the foremost slave traders during parts of the 1600s, and in the following century, English and French merchants controlled about half of the transatlantic slave trade, taking a large percentage of their human cargo from the region of West Africa between the Senegal and Niger rivers. Probably no more than a few 100,000 Africans were taken to the Americas before 1600. In the 17th century, however, demand for slave labor rose sharply with the growth of sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake region in North America. The largest numbers of slaves were taken to the Americas during the 18th century when, according to historians' estimates, nearly 3/5 of the total volume of the transatlantic slave trade took place. The slave trade had devastating effects in Africa. Economic incentives for warlords and tribes to engage in the slave trade promoted an atmosphere of lawlessness and violence. Depopulation and a continuing fear of captivity made economic and agricultural development almost impossible throughout much of Western Africa. Historians have debated the nature and extent of European and African agency in the actual capture of those who were enslaved. During the early years of the transatlantic slave trade, the Portuguese generally purchased Africans who had been taken as slaves during tribal wars. As the demand for slaves grew, the Portuguese began to enter the interior of Africa to forcibly take captives, as other Europeans became involved in the slave trade. Generally, they remained on the coast and purchased captives from Africans who had transported them from the interior. Following capture, the Africans were marched to the coast, a journey that could be as many as 300 miles. Typically, 2 captives were chained together at the ankle, and columns of captives were tied together by ropes around their necks. An estimated 10 to 15% of captives died on their way to the coast. The Atlantic Passage, or Middle Passage, was notorious for its brutality and for the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions on slave ships, which hundreds of Africans were packed tightly into tiers below decks. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of African slaves bound for the Americas died aboard slave ships. The autobiographical account of West African Olaudah Equiano, published in 1789, is particularly well known for its graphic descriptions of the suffering endured on the transatlantic voyages. At the time of the American Revolution, about 1775 to 1783, there was a widespread support in the Northern American colonies for prohibiting the importation of more slaves. However, after the Revolution, at the insistence of the Southern states, Congress waited more than 2 decades before making the importation of slaves illegal. When Congress did so in 1808, the law was enacted with little dissent, but Caribbean smugglers frequently violated the law until it was enforced by the Northern blockade of the South in 1861 during the American Civil War. So that's kind of a bigger general overview of what the transatlantic slave trade looked like. And I think it's important to kind of pick out a few narratives that we see here. An argument that I have heard before is that we don't need to focus on American slavery or blame America for the transatlantic slave trade. 1, because African people were already enslaving one another, and 2, because America wasn't the worst country at enslaving people, or they didn't do it the most or have the most slaves or those sorts of things. So the first thing, we can see that there is a nugget of truth in the fact that some African nations were enslaving people already. It was sometimes a punishment, or instead of imprisonment or some other punishment for criminal activity, people would be enslaved, and then those slaves were sold to Europeans as they came by and were interacting with these African nations a little bit more. Though, as the Britannica article tells us, that increased, or the number of people that were enslaved increased, the kinds of crimes that could lead to enslavement increased because there was money to be made from enslaving people. But then also some Europeans would go through and forcibly just kidnap people and take people. So there was a precedent for African nations or African leaders enslaving people or using slavery as a punishment for criminal activity. However, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, the way that slavery was rationalized was more about criminal activity, or maybe being a prisoner of war or something in different African nations and tribes, whereas the way that Europeans rationalized it in what would become the United States of America and other colonies and countries in South and Central America started to be more about this pseudoscience, this pseudobiology that is basically the forerunner of racism, and this kind of idea that some people were just made inferior and therefore they were allowed to be enslaved. Whereas in the continent of Africa, some of that might have existed as well, but I think the Britannica article shows us that it was more about criminal activity and being a prisoner of war, and wasn't a permanent or biological, supposedly, situation. So I think in order to be a good citizen of the country that I reside in, I need to have a good understanding of the history of this country and share that good understanding with others. History is often used in every single country, but including America, history is often used as this propaganda type way of making people be more patriotic and be like, oh, we're so good, we're the best, look at our history, we're the best. And I think that's really dangerous because ultimately it's a lie. And I don't think true patriotism comes from telling lies or learning lies about your country. True patriotism comes from recognizing the different successes and tragedies that exist in your country's history and seeking a good understanding of them so that we can make better choices in our present and for our future. So I think it's important to learn the historical tragedies of America, whether that be tragedies in Black history or in other areas of history. There are plenty of other areas of history. Not all the tragedies in our history are condensed into the history of Black Americans, but I think it's important to understand all of these different tragedies so that we can understand what our country is, the choices that people in our past have made, and then make better choices in the future. So when I focus on talking about American slavery or America's role in the transatlantic slave trade, it's not because America is the absolute worst or I want people to hate America or anything like that. It's true, as we'll go over some numbers and stuff later, it's true there were a lot more enslaved people transported into South America, into Brazil especially. I think that's where most enslaved people were taken. But so absolutely, there's a nugget of truth in that argument that America wasn't the worst. But I don't think anybody wins when we start having an argument about who had it worse or who was the worst. We don't need to compare numbers of enslavement or of genocide or different things like that. Like sometimes things are just bad and they can be just bad. Now, absolutely, if somebody is trying to tell you America enslaved the most people and was the absolute worst and is just the worst country in the whole world and did everything worse than everybody else, that's not true. And we don't need to tell lies about America to make it look worse than it is. But if you're a person who's uncomfortable learning about the different things that have happened in American history that are not so good or not worth celebrating, if that makes you uncomfortable, I would encourage you to kind of like push on that feeling a little bit and explore more like, why are you so uncomfortable about this? Why do you want to push back against focusing on these things and focusing on America's role in these things? Is it because you've never heard it before? Is this new information to you? Do you think history should only focus on the successes? And I would just encourage you to wrestle with that a little bit more before just having an emotional reaction and shutting down and not taking in this information, this truth about our country. Yeah, so that was a little mini rant in there. So next I have a Wikipedia article talking more about the difference between slavery in Africa and in the Americas. So it says, forms of slavery varied both in Africa and in the Americas. In general, slavery in Africa was not heritable. That is, the children of slaves were free, while in the Americas, children of slave mothers were considered born into slavery. This was connected to another distinction. Slavery in West Africa was not reserved for racial or religious minorities as it was in the European colonies, although the case was otherwise in places such as Somalia, where Bantus were taken as slaves for the ethnic Somalis. The treatment of slaves in Africa was more variable than in the Americas. At one extreme, the kings of Dahomey routinely slaughtered slaves in hundreds or thousands of sacrificial rituals, and slaves as human sacrifices were also known in Cameroon. On the other hand, slaves in other places were often treated as part of the family, as like adopted children, with significant rights, including the right to marry without their master's permission. Scottish explorer Mungo Park wrote, "The slaves in Africa, I suppose, are nearly in the proportion of 3-to-1 to the freemen. They claim no reward for their services except food and clothing, and are treated with kindness or severity, according to the good or bad disposition of their masters. The slaves which are thus brought from the interior may be divided into the two distinct classes. First, such as were slaves from their birth, having been born of enslaved mothers. Secondly, such as were born free, but who afterwards, by whatever means, became slaves. Those of the first description are by far the most numerous. And then, in the Americas, slaves were denied the right to marry freely, and masters did not generally accept them as equal members of the family. Slaves in the Americas were considered the property owners, and slaves convicted of revolt or murder were executed." That brings a little bit more nuance to our understanding of both slavery that had existed in the continent of Africa and then also how it kind of changed and evolved in the Americas and became something different. And of course, there is variety within both of these things. Obviously, Africa is a huge continent with lots of different tribes and lots of different nations. And so there's a lot of difference there and what slavery looked like. And in the Americas, there was lots of difference too. There were quite a few different colonies, quite a few different European nations that were participating in slavery. And to understand the differences that existed there and how in the Americas, the institution of slavery became more permanent and more restrictive than it ever had been in any of the African nations. So I wanted to look a little bit more at the numbers too, because I think the numbers of the transatlantic slave trade can sometimes be hard to wrap our brains around and really understand what a huge, impactful historical event that this was. And I say huge and impactful mostly in a bad way. This ended up not really benefiting very many people at all. But anyway, from Wikipedia, the transatlantic slave trade resulted in a vast and as yet unknown loss of life for African captives both in and outside the Americas. Quote, "More than 1 million people are thought to have died," end quote, during their transport to the Americas, according to a BBC report. More died soon after their arrival. The number of lives lost in the procurement of slaves remains a mystery, but it may equal or exceed the number who who survived to be enslaved. The harsh nature of the trade led to the destruction of individuals and cultures. Historian Ana Lucia Araujo has noted that the process of enslavement did not end with the arrival on Western Hemisphere shores. The different paths taken by the individuals and groups who were victims of the Atlantic slave trade were influenced by different factors, including the disembarking region, the ability to be sold on the market, the kind of work performed, gender, age, religion, and language. Patrick Manning estimates that about 12 million slaves entered the Atlantic slave trade between the 16th and 19th century, but about 1.5 million died on board ship. About 10.5 million slaves arrived in the Americas. Besides the slaves who died on the Middle Passage, more Africans likely died during the slave raids in Africa and forced marches to ports. Manning estimates that 4 million died inside Africa after capture, and many more died young. Manning's estimate covers the 12 million who were originally destined for the Atlantic, as well as the 6 million destined for Asian slave trade markets, and the 8 million destined for African markets. Of the slaves shipped to the Americas, the largest share went to Brazil and to the Caribbean. And this article doesn't mention it here, but I remember learning from a class I took on history of modern Latin America is that the fact that the reason why the most enslaved people by far went to Brazil, especially, was because that so many enslaved people were dying because of the kind of work that the colonizers in Brazil were requiring of the enslaved people. I think it was mostly like mining for silver, I think. It was definitely work in the mines that was very, very dangerous. And so people were dying very, very quickly. Yeah, and so that's why they kept importing enslaved people. And I think, okay, so when we're looking at these numbers, sometimes we can just get overwhelmed by the numbers and by the tragedy of it all. And so to kind of like separate ourselves a little bit from being overwhelmed, we stop thinking of enslaved people as people, and we don't take a moment to contemplate the vastness and just how many people were affected by this system and how many people lost their lives before they were captured, or like in the process of being captured, in the process of being transported, or just in the process of existing within the institution of slavery. And so sometimes when I try to process like big numbers like this, I think of, I guess, like being the most people that I've ever been around. So like at a college football game, I know that the stadium at my university fits like 90,000 people. And obviously haven't been there in a while. And with the pandemic, I haven't been around 90,000 people in quite some time. But I know what that looks like. And even that is only a fraction of how many people went through the process of the Middle Passage. Okay, I did some quick math because I was just interested in figuring that out. So I would need about 134 full stadiums of 90,000 people to have the same number of people as were enslaved throughout the Atlantic slave trade. That's a lot of people. I have a link in my description that gives us more like charts and pictures to understand these numbers as well. So from Katarina Buchholz at Statista, she says the United States is heavily associated with slavery and the capture and forceful relocation of Africans. About 300,000 disembarked in the U.S. directly, while many more arrived via the inter-American slave trade from the Caribbean or Latin America. It is estimated that almost 4.5 million enslaved Africans arrived in the Caribbean and another 3.2 million in present-day Brazil. Around 40% of Africans uprooted in slavery are believed to have come from Angola and southern Africa, with another 30% who came from the Bay of Benin and West Africa. The numbers taken from the database project slavevoyages.org indicate the number of Africans disembarking. Many more died on the way because of lack of food and water and horrid conditions aboard the slave ships. Others were uprooted in the Trans-Saharan, the Red Sea, and Indian slave trade, which partly predated the transatlantic slave trade. It is estimated that close to 20 million people were forced to leave the African continent enslaved. By 1800, this had decimated the African population to half the size it would have been if slavery had not occurred. And then I have another source from History in Charts, another good picture if you want more like visuals to really understand this. It is estimated that only around 388,000 out of a total of 12.5 million African slaves made it to North America. That's only about 3% of the total. A vast majority of African slaves were shipped to Brazil, about 4.9 million, or 39%. The massive influx of slaves was needed to support the growth of the Brazilian sugar economy. In addition, once gold and diamonds were discovered, slaves were needed to mine the valuable deposits. The Caribbean was the next top destination for slaves. The area was flush with sugar, tobacco, coffee, and other plantations that were in need of manual labor to power them. Haiti, part of the French Empire, and Jamaica, part of the British Empire, were two of the largest destinations for slaves. Other destinations included the Dutch Americas as well as the Danish West Indies. A small number of slaves were shipped to other destinations, including Europe, as well as other locations in Africa. And so I think that gives us a better understanding of just like how many people were affected by this system, and then also how it changed the different nations that exist today. And so from our chart site, we can see that like 39% about of enslaved people were taken to Brazil, and only about 3% were taken to North America, which would be the United States. So I think that's an interesting thing to wrestle with and to understand. And just a reminder, too, that just because we're talking about the tragedies, the horrors that the United States is complicit in, does not mean that we are arguing that the United States was the worst. I don't think a conversation about who was the worst is something that we really need to have. I don't think we need to stop and be like, wow, Brazil was the worst at the slave trade because they enslaved and killed the most people. I think the dehumanizing nature of trading and buying and selling and kidnapping people, a whole group of people, I think that's bad enough that we don't need to decide who did it worst or who did it best. I think that's just not a good conversation to waste our time on. And I also wanted to point to as well, not only was the cost of the transatlantic slave trade in people's lives and livelihoods, but also in their history, in their identity, in their culture, and in their language. We talked a little bit in that last episode I did about lots of different people throughout Black history in America. And one person that I thought was particularly fascinating and kind of relating back to this topic was Malcolm X, who changed his last name to X to signify his lost tribal history and language and culture. And so that loss is happening here with the transatlantic slave trade, when people are being forcibly taken from their homes and from their own people and taken to a new land and forced to become part of a new culture. There is a loss in history and culture and language that comes along with the loss in life and the dehumanization of entire groups of people. So next I want to talk more about how people rationalized the transatlantic slave trade, and specifically enslaving only African people as far as like Europeans go. So from Wikipedia, a guy named Walter Rodney states, the role of slavery in promoting racist prejudice and ideology has been carefully studied in certain situations, especially in the USA. The simple fact is that no people can enslave another for 4 centuries without coming out with a notion of superiority, and when the color and other physical traits of these peoples were quite different, it was inevitable that prejudice should take a racist form. Eric Williams argued that, quote, a racial twist was given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. Slavery was not born of racism, rather racism was the consequence of slavery. However, the belief that the Caucasian Europeans were divinely ordained by an omnipotent Judeo-Christian God as superior to other human races with a darker skin, a major tenet of the white supremacy movement, was one of the basic perceptions that would allow industrial-scale slavery across the Atlantic to thrive. In the Americas, therefore, slavery and racism seem to have strengthened each other. And then from BBC, I have another article. Again, these will all be in my description, but from BBC it says, virtually everyone agrees that slavery is inhumane and degrading and wrong. But since for so much of history many people defended it, it's important to demonstrate why it's wrong. So this article goes through various arguments that people made about arguments people made to defend slavery. And the first argument is it is natural that some people are slaves. This argument says that some people are slaves as part of the natural order of the universe or as part of God's plan, and it is wrong to interfere with this by abolishing slavery, though of course nobody nowadays regards slavery as a natural thing. But if this argument was to be used, then there would have had to been some certain way of distinguishing natural slaves from those who should not be enslaved. Without such a method, injustice is sure to occur. No such test is possible, although past cultures thought there could be such tests. Another argument was slaves are inferior beings. This argument says that even if slavery is cruel and degrading, slaves are not fully human, and so their suffering is as ethically important or unimportant as the suffering of domestic animals, and they do not have any rights that would justify abolition of slavery. Some people take this argument further, or would take the argument further, and said that slaves are beings who are so inferior that they deserve to be enslaved. This argument has often developed into racism to justify the enslavement of certain population groups. Some of the defenders of the Atlantic slave trade argued that slavery was the proper place for people of African descent. These arguments have been used in very recent times to justify enslaving particular racial groups. And this group of arguments nowadays is regarded as completely misguided, as would all of these, I would say. The next one that BBC looks at is the argument that slavery is good for slaves. This argument teaches that slaves lack the ability to run their own lives and are therefore better off and happier in a system where their lives are run by others. This is more of a paternalistic argument, is what we'll call it, and has been used quite often throughout history. I think we can see it in some American policies towards Native Americans. This paternalistic idea comes up as well, but it's ridiculous. Another argument for slavery was that slavery would be too difficult to abolish. It's not a justification for slavery, but it's kind of why people would just kind of turn away from it, because it would uproot their whole economic system that they had established with slavery. And kind of leading off of that, another argument that people would make for slavery was that slaves were essential to certain industries. And so the employers, the enslavers, would claim that abolishing slavery would be economically disastrous. But obviously this is more of a money-focused argument and not an ethical one in any sense. Another argument is slavery was acceptable in this culture. And this one is interesting. So the BBC talks about how slavery was generally accepted by the majority in some societies. And I think we see this argument sometimes from people today that was like, well, we can't blame the founding fathers for having slaves because it was acceptable in their culture. And while, okay, so like there's some truth to that. Like we shouldn't say like, wow, the founding fathers were worse than other people of their time period because they had slaves. I think that's not what we're saying. We're saying that they're no better than anyone else from their time period because they lived in a culture that condoned slavery, and we can say as people that was wrong and dehumanizing. We don't have to make excuses for them or be like, oh, it's just part of their time period, because that doesn't make it any more okay. There are a couple other arguments on the BBC article if you want to look at them, but I think the ones I've already mentioned are kind of the ones that are more interesting, honestly. And I think it's important to kind of look at the rhetoric that people used to argue for slavery, to protect slavery. Because okay, so now sitting in this year, 2021, we can say enslaving people was bad and dehumanizing. And lots of these reasons that people came up with are lies. And it's basically just racist, basically just shallow excuses because they needed to protect their economic systems that they had created. They needed to kind of explain away to their own minds this bad thing that they were doing. And so having a good understanding of that, I think, then leads to seeing how those ideas molded and changed throughout time. Because sitting here in the year 2021, we can all agree that enslaving people is not good. And in American history, a lot of harm was done through that. But the ideas and arguments from people that supported slavery, defended slavery, can mutate into different ideas and different arguments today. That's why we are still dealing with racism in the United States today, is because some of the ideas that have their roots in defending slavery still exist today. I know that seems wild. That might seem entirely impossible to some people, but I think when we look at it a little bit more, we can see how this has happened. So another thing, too, is people have argued like, well, didn't we fight a whole war to get rid of slavery? Aren't we done dealing with slavery in the United States? And I think if you listen to my last episode going through a big, long overview, I know it was long, I'm sorry. This one's going to be kind of long, too. But going through that big, long overview of American history, we can see that even once the Civil War ended, like Black Americans were still facing prejudice and hardship and had to fight for equal rights, for civil rights, to be treated better over and over throughout American history. That has been a struggle. And so just because the institution of slavery was abolished doesn't mean that this kind of rhetoric also was abolished, or that racism just disappeared, because people had created these structures to excuse slavery for whatever, according to whatever reasons they found fit. And so those ideas didn't just leave people's heads or stop being taught to their children, to their grandchildren, to their great-grandchildren. So I kind of wanted to look at next, what kind of world did this create? We can see that the transatlantic slave trade forcibly migrated millions of people all over the world, putting different people groups, different groups of people with African descent in different parts of the world that were not the continent of Africa. And we can see that the transatlantic slave trade erased culture and languages and killed a lot of people as well. Many people did not survive this trade. And it also created rhetoric and a social idea and pseudo-biological idea that certain groups of people were better than or more deserving of freedom than other groups of people. And so how do we deal with this? So how have we dealt with this, I think, is the better question, actually. What kind of world did this create? From Wikipedia, On February 24th, 2007, the Virginia General Assembly passed the House Joint Resolution number 728, acknowledging, quote, with profound regret, the involuntary servitude of Africans and the exploitation of Native Americans, and call for reconciliation among Virginians. With the passing of that resolution, Virginia became the first of the 50 United States to acknowledge through the state's governing body their state's involvement in slavery. The passing of this resolution came on the heels of the 400th anniversary celebration of the city of Jamestown, Virginia, which was the first permanent English colony to survive in what would become the United States. Jamestown is also recognized as one of the first slave ports of the American colonies. On May 31st, 2007, the governor of Alabama, Bob Riley, signed a resolution expressing profound regret for Alabama's role in slavery and apologizing for slavery's wrongs and lingering effects. Alabama is the fourth state to pass a slavery apology, following votes by the legislatures in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. On July 30th, 2008, the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution apologizing for American slavery and subsequent discriminatory laws. The language included a reference to the, quote, fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. On June 18th, 2009, the United States Senate issued an apologetic statement decrying the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery, end quote. The news was welcomed by President at the time, Barack Obama. So the idea of apologizing for one's past is an interesting one, and I think a difficult one to work with, because that doesn't mean that whoever was in the Senate and the House of Representatives at this time was personally responsible for slavery or for Jim Crow. Nobody alive today was alive when American slavery existed or when Jim Crow existed, for the most part, or the height of Jim Crow at the very least. So to apologize isn't necessarily blaming oneself or blaming people today or trying to say that people should feel guilty for these things. I think these apologies are very important because it's recognizing this historical tragedy and recognizing that the people who were responsible died before they got the opportunity to apologize. And so people who were victims of these different injustices and cruelties and brutalities never received justice, never received an acknowledgement for the horrors that they went through because the people who enacted those horrors died. And so it's more not taking the blame, but making a step to right those injustices and acknowledging that an apology is needed, and the people that should have given it are dead now, and they can't do that. But somebody still needs to recognize that this tragedy has happened in our country and that it needs to be made right. So in that sense, like the fact that as a country, we are acknowledging the horror and injustice of the institution of slavery for the first time officially in the 2000s, I think that says a lot. I think that says a lot about our lack of understanding and focus on Black history in America and our lack of understanding of the historical tragedies that we carry and how we need to respond to them and teach them and just better process them as ourselves, as Americans and whatnot. And I think this difficulty of really understanding the importance of this and the power in recognizing historical tragedies and the injustice that it is to continue to not recognize them or talk about them well is expressed quite clearly through Trump's 1776 commission, which I've talked about before, and I think it will come up again. But this was I don't know what exactly it is. The 1776 commission was created by former President Trump in September of 2020 as a direct response to the New York Times 1619 Project, which focuses on America's roots of slavery and racial injustice. So from HuffPost, the report notably defends the country's founding fathers who owned slaves, arguing that slavery was not, quote, a uniquely American evil, end quote, and urging that the institution be seen in a much broader perspective. The report goes on to justify the Three-Fifths Compromise, in which white lawmakers from northern and southern states in 1787 agreed to count Black people as 3/5 of a person for congressional representation, saying that this was, quote, just that, compromises, and that, as a question of practical politics, no durable union would have been formed without a compromise among the states on the issue of slavery, end quote. Historian and slavery scholar Dana Ramey Berry said the report, quote, advocates teaching a narrow, patriotic history of America and aims to muzzle those who seek a full and accurate history of America, including the journalists of the New York Times 1619 Project. She continues, from a historian's vantage point, the report cannot be taken as a solid piece of historical work. It seeks to justify slavery and its damaging aftermath in order to indoctrinate yet another generation of American students. The last 4 years, underscored by the last few weeks, have demonstrated how fragile our embrace of truth can be and the consequences of purposeful disinformation. So the 1776 Commission seems to be arguing some of the things that I already kind of addressed, that slavery is not a uniquely American evil, and we need to have a broader perspective. Well, I feel like I've given you a broader perspective the last however many minutes. And those things are true. See how dangerous misinformation is? Those things are true. The transatlantic slave trade was not just to America. It was to the Americas. Lots of different colonies were enslaving people and receiving slaves. And it is important to understand this tragedy in a much broader perspective, because then we can understand the tragedy that so many millions of people faced, just versus the hundreds of thousands that faced it in the United States. However, they're using these little nuggets of truth to try and undo looking at this part of American history at all, or being critical and being perceptive about this area of American history at all. Misinformation is dangerous, and sometimes it's hard to recognize because people will do stuff like this. They will use things that are truthful in an untruthful way. And I think that's very dangerous, because that doesn't allow us to pursue justice and pursue righting the wrongs and the hurt that our ancestors have committed. And instead, we're just continuing those. And the founding fathers, the slaveholders that existed in America, they're all dead. They don't need us to defend them and to say that they were the best people ever. We can acknowledge that they did work to build our country, while also acknowledging that some of the things they did were not great. Some of these things kind of sucked, like a lot, and have lasting effects on entire groups of people, as well as huge effects on just absolutely destroying people's history and people's culture. And okay, I'm going to move on a little bit to this little passage from the 1776 Commission. Still not really sure like what they did. Like, did they just write things, or like, what does this mean? But anyway, this is from the 1776 Commission on Slavery. They say, quote, "The most common charge leveled against the founders, and hence against our country itself, is that they were hypocrites who didn't believe in their stated principles, and therefore the country they built rests on a lie. This charge is untrue and has done enormous damage, especially in recent years, with a devastating effect on our civic unity and social fabric. Many Americans labor under the illusion that slavery was somehow a uniquely American evil. It is essential to insist at the outset that the institution be seen in a much broader perspective. It is very hard for people brought up in the comforts of modern America, in a time in which the idea that all human beings have inviolable rights and inherent dignity is almost taken for granted, to imagine the cruelties and enormities that were endemic in earlier times. But the unfortunate fact is that the institution of slavery has been more the rule than the exception throughout human history." So what they're doing here rhetorically is trying to make American slavery seem like not that big a deal, because other countries did it as well, and it existed as well throughout history. Well, okay, fine. Guess what? We don't live in other countries. Maybe you're listening and you do live in another country. The history of America isn't your responsibility if you're not from America. If you are from America, the history of America is your responsibility to understand it well and to not perpetuate lies about it. And for the 1776 Commission or whatever to come from the American government, we don't need to be talking about all the other countries that committed slavery, because this is the American government. We're trying to come to terms with our own history, our own country's history. And so it seems silly to be like, why are we only talking about America? Well, because this is American history. We're only talking about slavery that existed in America because we're talking about American history. We've chosen to focus on American history as Americans because we need to have a better understanding of our country and our history, so we can have a better understanding of the changes that we need to make in the future in our country. I'm not going to go over and make changes in the country of Brazil because I'm not Brazilian. So while it is also good to have good understandings of history in other countries, I'm not saying that as Americans we shouldn't study Brazilian history. I think Brazilian history is fascinating. However, when we have responsibilities as citizens, our responsibilities are here in America, not in Brazil. So I could rant forever about the 1776 Commission, and I probably will a little bit later, but let's wrap this up. All right, so I wanted to end with some misconceptions, but I kind of accidentally just kind of weaved those in throughout my thing while I was talking. So first misconception, weren't some African nations already practicing slavery? And so this actually isn't a misconception. That's true. There were nations and tribes in Africa that were already practicing slavery or would enslave people to sell to the Europeans as the transatlantic slave trade got going. However, the misconception in this is minimizing the practice of slavery in the American colonies by saying, well, they were doing it in Africa too. It looked different in Africa, and it was heightened by the market that the Europeans were creating by wanting more enslaved people for their colonies. So that is an important truth to recognize, but also recognize it in context. Next misconception. Didn't we fight a whole war to deal with slavery in America? Why do we still talk about it now? All right, here's my question in response for that. How many national memorials or monuments do we have lamenting the dehumanizing system of slavery? How many do we have commemorating the leaders who fought to keep slavery? There's a big difference. I don't think we have any national memorials or monuments to lament the dehumanizing system of slavery, but we have 10 military bases named after Confederate leaders. It is not rare to see the Confederate flag flown in general, or just in general outside of a history class. That is kind of normal in America, especially in the American South, to see the Confederate flag elsewhere, to see people have it on their trucks and whatever. Not to just rag on truck drivers. The Confederate flag is elsewhere too. Not all truck drivers would fly the Confederate flag. Sorry. I don't even know where to go from here. Okay, here's my most controversial opinion. Honestly, celebrating or honoring the Confederacy in any way is the most anti-American thing you can do. It's entirely unpatriotic. The Confederacy is not part of Southern culture or heritage. It's an embarrassing group of pathetic losers and traitors to the United States. There's no reason to fly the Confederate flag or to stick it on the back of your car. In my opinion, we should treat the Confederate flag more like the Nazi flag and handle our historical tragedies more seriously. You might have had a little reaction in your gut when I compared the Confederate flag to the Nazi flag. You might think that's unfair. However, the Confederacy is a group of people that fought for the continued enslavement of Black Americans, the continued dehumanization of Black Americans, the continued exploitation of Black Americans. And I don't want to get in a rut comparing historical tragedies and be like, well, the Nazis were worse than the Confederacy. Like, at some point, we just need to acknowledge that things are just bad. And we don't need to continue to support or celebrate things that were bad. We need to have a better understanding that the fact that this tragedy was enacted. And I think the fact that there are people in this country that continue to uphold the Confederacy and the Confederate flag as something worth celebrating at all, I think that speaks to the fact that we do not have a good understanding of the historical tragedies we carry as a country. We do not have a good understanding of the transatlantic slave trade and the effects on America, and we need to do better and learn more and be better. Didn't realize I was going to get so heated at the end of this, but that's about all I got for you. So thank you guys so much for sleuthing with me and putting up with all of my rants. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something, challenged in some way. The featured Black History podcast of this episode is Black History for White People. Definitely check them out to learn more about Black history and specific issues that originated in the past but still affect our society today. I'll put a link to this podcast in my description, as well as the other sources that I used in this episode. And I will catch you guys when we'll talk about how Americans used the Bible to fight for and against slavery. Don't forget to follow History Sleuth wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss it, and rate and review when you can. I hope you have a great day. Bye.